Hi everyone. Some of you will remember that the last two elections, I wrote a series of essays kind of describing what I thought was going on in both of those elections, and you'll remember that in 2016, I thought that Trump was going to win, and last time I was pretty sure that Joe Biden was going to win, and I wrote about that in my essays. But I've decided to do a video this time with only a few days to go and just give some thoughts and go on the record about it. Even if I end up being wrong, I figured I'd just go on the record about it. So the first thing is going to describe the kind of the dynamics of what I think is happening and why, to make it a little bit more understandable to everyone. So, as some of you may know, the most important thing to know about every US presidential election is that because of the electoral college system, where essentially based on how many people live in a state, they get a certain number of electors to send to the electoral college. And what that basically means is that it's not the number of votes in the country that wins you the election, it's the number of state votes towards the total of 270 that wins you the election. So in practical terms, what this means is that states that are definitely going to vote Republican don't really matter towards deciding the outcome, and states that definitely going to vote Democratic don't really matter towards deciding the outcome either. Everything kind of hinges on these states that swing back and forth between choosing Republicans and choosing Democrats, and that can change over time, but typically it's 7 states. So the whole thing is kind of won or lost in these 7 swing states, and I'm going to go through each of them in turn and explain why I think this time that dynamic means that Donald Trump is going to win again. And I actually don't think it's going to be close. You need 270 votes in the electoral college to win the election. I think Trump's going to get over, actually think he's going to get over 300, and maybe even as much as 320. So I think it's going to be not exactly a landslide, because I think he's going to lose the popular vote. But as I said before, the popular vote doesn't matter. It's how many states you win and how many points essentially you get per state that wins you the election. So I'm going to go through the 7 swing states in turn and kind of explain the thinking. So firstly, Arizona. Arizona went for Joe Biden last time. It was part of how he won the election. Since then, it's just been completely open borders, essentially. That's probably an exaggeration, but I think the people in Arizona feel like there's almost no border control. And because Arizona is a border state that borders Mexico, and because Biden and Harris have done very little about this, and really only tried to do anything about it in the last year when they realized an election was coming up, I struggle to see them winning Arizona this time. So for that reason, I think Arizona goes for Trump. Nevada, also in the kind of southwest or far west, not many electoral votes. It's kind of a small state because it's basically Las Vegas. Traditionally, the big unions in Las Vegas have voted Democratic, but I think that coalition is in the process of fragmenting, and I do expect Nevada to go for Trump this time. I think the unions just think that Trump will be better for I shouldn't say the unions think this. I think the unions still back the Democrats. I think a lot of union members in Nevada think that Trump is going to be better for the economy. And look, Vegas is a gaudy place. Trump has always promoted gaudy industries. It's not a huge stretch to say that like Nevada um, is going to go is going to go Republican. The Democrats only won it by the thinnest of margins last time, and I think there's also a lot of Hispanic voters in Nevada, and I think increasingly amongst men especially, a lot of minority voters are coming back to Trump because they think that he's just sort of better for the economy and then better for their pocketbooks, basically. And so whether that's true or not, frankly, doesn't matter. They think that. I think that's one reason why Nevada goes for Trump. So that's two of the swing states. So, from there we kind of move over to Florida. Florida's not really a swing state. It's been reliably Republican for quite some time, and I don't think there's any dynamic really to change that. Florida has no income tax at the state level. It tends to attract people who have a bit more of a kind of low tax mindset, and Trump has promised a lot of tax cuts, especially for the wealthy, that I'll have to go into on a different post. But for those reasons, I think a lot of baby boomer retirees, they want to stretch their dollars into retirement. Florida's just reliably Republican at this point. Could be wrong about that, but unlikely to swing. So then there's another interesting one, which was actually won by Trump last time when he lost the election to Joe Biden. As you move up the East Coast, is North Carolina. North Carolina has not, I think, voted for a Democrat for president in quite some time, but the demographics of the state are shifting rapidly. It's just exploding in population. It's really easy to do business there. There's not a lot of red tape. As you move north up the eastern seaboard into Maryland, places like that, Delaware, Pennsylvania, there's a lot more red tape for businesses. And the climate, frankly, is gorgeous in North Carolina. It's beautiful. You've got a coastal strip, and then you've got these beautiful mountains with towns like Asheville. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous place. A lot of people are moving there, a lot of activity. So the demographics are changing very rapidly. And so I think that there is a chance, also partly because the Republican candidate for governor in North Carolina is kind of a maniac, and you can Google that. There's a good chance that the Democrats are going to take North Carolina. I wouldn't say it's guaranteed. And as we'll see, even if they do, it's probably not enough to offset some of the problems they have elsewhere in the swing states. So then from North Carolina, we move up to Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania is still a very, very populous state. It's worth a lot of votes in the electoral college, and it's a big deal because it traditionally swings back and forth between choosing Republicans and choosing Democrats. It's a big state with a lot of rural areas and two major cities in Philadelphia and, to a lesser extent, Pittsburgh. Like the country as a whole, the cities tend to be more diverse and tend to choose Democrats, and the countryside and the suburbs tend to choose Republicans for reasons that are kind of mirrored across the country. The key for the Democrats to win Pennsylvania has always been turnout in the metropolitan area of Philadelphia. There's just a ton of people there, and if you can get them to turn out and vote, then you can win Pennsylvania. I think they've got major problems in Pennsylvania, specifically with African American men who are abandoning the Democratic Party. And what we're really seeing is the fragmentation of the traditional Democratic coalition playing out in places like Philadelphia. African Americans have always been a reliable voting bloc for the Democratic Party. In typical cycles, it's over 90% voting Democrat. So the problem that the Democrats now have in Philadelphia is that African American men specifically have increasingly been put off by the swing to the left specifically on like social and cultural issues. Black Democrats are often more socially conservative than white Democrats, right? They're in the party coalition for different reasons, quite frankly. And the kind of Democratic elite sort of pushing issues around LGBTQ, which are really important to the Democratic elite, but are not important to working class African American men, quite frankly. They just don't care. I think increasingly those men have been alienated by this push. And so, they sent Barack Obama a few weeks ago to Philadelphia and to other places specifically to ask African American men to vote for Kamala. And I'm not sure that it's working. And so I think you're going to see some African American men in Philadelphia voting for Trump, and you're going to have others who are just going to stay home. They might not be able to bring themselves to vote for Trump, but they just don't care. They don't feel like the modern Democratic Party is speaking to them. African American women a little bit more committed to the cause. So maybe those women can get men to the polls. We'll see. But there is a chance that the turnout in Philadelphia will be too low. And honestly, this is one of those things where the city of Philadelphia, I think the whole election could frankly swing on a few cities, and the city of Philadelphia is one of them. So if you want to figure out who's winning on election night, all you have to do is look at turnout specifically in the metropolitan Philadelphia area, because that area is so reliably Democratic. That like 8 in 10 or 9 in 10 votes are going to go Democratic. So you just need a huge turnout and engagement in that area in order to counteract all of the rural Pennsylvania voters, what my brother-in-law calls Central Pennsylvania, who are all going to vote Republican, right? And they've got a pretty good ground game in the state. So they're going to, they're definitely going to get out their vote. And they hope to have a high level of enthusiasm amongst their supporters, which does seem to be the case. So that's Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania is worth so many votes that if you can't get out the vote in Philly, it's really hard to recover from losing that state. You basically have to pick up Arizona, Nevada, and some of these other places that I don't think she's going to pick up. So Pennsylvania and Philly in particular is just a bellwether for the whole thing. As goes Philly, goes the election. So we'll see. It makes this one really hard to call, because there is a chance that they will be able to mobilize people at the last minute from this kind of sheer dread of a sort of return to Donald Trump will motivate minority voters in urban Philadelphia to get out and vote and carry the state for the Democrats. But it's on such a knife edge. It's really hard to tell. My gut tells me that Pennsylvania is going to go to Trump by maybe as much as 1 or 2%. But honestly, no one knows. So that's Pennsylvania. So the next swing state in the old Rust Belt that is maybe even more interesting than Pennsylvania. It's almost as many electoral votes as Pennsylvania. It's equally critical. Along with Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, Michigan is a must-win state, really, for Harris. Like, she has to win all three of those states. So let's talk about Michigan. So Michigan has two really, really interesting attributes that are going to play a role in this election. first of all, it's the home of all the big American automotive companies in and around Detroit. And so that means there's a huge amount of union representation there. And historically, that union representation has been a block vote for the Democratic Party. Starting a year ago, Trump, in his kind of, Trumpy kind of art of the deal kind of way, started making sort of pretty flagrant, direct financial offers to automotive workers in the automotive industry in general, right? And so what he did was he started threatening to put tariffs on foreign cars and foreign EVs in particular. And so, that's just simply going to make foreign cars really uncompetitive. And so, that's great in the short term if you're in the automotive industry, which a lot of people in Michigan either in that industry or they indirectly profit from it, restaurants near auto plants, whatever it might be. So if you're in that world, that might be quite appealing to you. And even if the union boss says, we always vote Democratic, you need to block vote the union vote. Culturally, you've got a lot of kind of traditional male kind of manufacturing jobs, and so there's just a lot of people up there who are just culturally aligned with Trump. Michigan was won by the Democrats last time by the narrowest of margins. It was something like 20,000 votes in a very populous state. It was not a big margin, so it wouldn't take much to swing it back. And so I think Trump's sustained sort of protectionist rhetoric is very appealing to unionized auto workers. I mean, it's the same concept of a union in a weird way, even though the Republicans have traditionally been anti-union. The concept of a union is basically we all kind of gang together and protect our jobs and, make sure that we get higher wages. And really, this tariff plan against, especially against Asian, but also European vehicle imports is that philosophy kind of writ large, right, at the national level. And so I think a lot of people in the unions will recognize that. The other thing about Michigan is a huge problem for the Democratic Party, which is that in and around Dearborn, there's an enormous Muslim population. Now, there aren't that many Muslims in the US. It's only about 1% of the population versus much higher numbers in the UK and France, where I think it's over 10% in both of those countries, and I think maybe even closer to approaching 15%. There aren't that many Muslims in America, but there's a big chunk of them in Dearborn, Michigan, and just like the Labour Party in the UK could reliably count on Muslim votes, Biden's support for the state of Israel in its war against the Palestinians is a huge sticking point for these guys. And so even though Donald Trump, when he was last president, had a Muslim ban and, all this stuff, I think the Muslims, for the most part, are not going to vote for Harris because she's in an administration that did not give them what they want. And the Democrat argument back to the Muslims is, well, Trump's going to be much worse. But I think that that's not how they think. Like, they don't care that Trump is going to be worse. They had a specific objective to exert their will around this one issue on the Democratic Party. And when they failed to do that, they essentially, as we say in England, they threw all their toys out of the pram, right? It's like they just weren't really interested in these bigger discussions about it for the most part. I'd say that community is probably pretty divided on it. But even if you lose half the Muslim community and they either stay home or, God forbid, vote for Trump, that's enough to kind of swing Michigan. It only took 20,000 votes last time to win the thing. Or I should say the margin was only 20,000 votes. So even if you have mass Muslim defections, and I think you will. And even though the Republicans support the state of Israel even more than the Democrats do, once those awful events happened in Gaza, it was almost a certainty that the Democratic Party, that was a home to both most of the Jews in America and most of the Arabs in America, and that had coexisted, maybe somewhat uneasily, but for the most part was fine. And then once the October 7th happened in Israel, it became really difficult and untenable, I think, for the Democrats to include both, it's about 7 million Jews and probably a similar number of Muslim voters in their coalition. And this is the hard thing, I mean, people accuse Kamala Harris of waffling on this issue, but honestly, what would you do? Inside your coalition that you need to win the election, you've got 7 million people who are pretty much convinced, a lot of them, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them are convinced that at a minimum, the state of Israel should no longer be supported. And a lot of them actually believe that the state of Israel should be wiped off the map. I know that's not like a popular thing to say out loud, but I think it's clear that some of them believe that. And then also in that group, you've got 90% of all Jews in America, which is, a similar number of Jewish people that live in Israel. Actually, it's a large Jewish population, and not only are they been reliable Democratic backers, they've provided a lot of politicians to the Democratic Party, and they provide an enormous amount of money to the Democratic Party in donations. And so having these two groups inside a party that's at each other's throats. Oh, and by the way, it just so happens that one of these groups is like a decisive voting bloc in one of the 3 states, really. I know I said there's 7 swing states, but there's really 3 states that decide this election, and that is Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. So for all those reasons, I think Michigan actually goes for Trump. I think he's probably, through luck and tactical appeals to specific voters and specific mindsets and specific industries, he's almost certainly sewn up Michigan. So now at this point, he's sewn up Michigan, I think he's sewn up Pennsylvania because of the apathy and defections in Philly. So at that point, it's looking really tough for Harris. And then the third one is Wisconsin. I actually think that the Democrats might hold Wisconsin, but it's going to be by the skin of their teeth. And again, it's going to require a big African American and general turnout in the city of Milwaukee. I'm not as up on what's going on in Milwaukee politics right now, but it's basically the state's too close to call, and given the history of polling being wrong by a couple of percentage points, where if it says Trump's up 1%, he's actually up 3%, that kind of thing, or if it says that he's down 1%, he's actually up 1%. It's a concept called preference falsification, basically, that people don't feel comfortable telling voters their true intent, and that there's a systematic bias in polls against Trump. Now, if that's true, then Wisconsin is gone, also. If the Republicans carry all 3 of those so-called blue wall states, then it's an absolute wipeout. It could very easily be a sort of 320 electoral college votes for Trump versus the 270 that he needs to win. So Wisconsin, I'm going to put in, probably it's a squeaker, but it just about goes blue. But because I think Pennsylvania and Michigan are both going to go red, I think, I don't see it happening. Ohio historically has been a bit of a swing state, but in the past few election cycles, it's been 5 points to the Republicans. And I even if some of that chips away this time, and it might. I don't think it's going to be enough to swing that one back to the Democrats. So I think Ohio goes red. I think Florida goes red. So yeah, that's what I think is going to happen. It's kind of strange because I do think Kamala's going to win more votes at the national level, but she's going to win them in places that she's already got enough votes to win the state, like California or New York, big populous states. There's some talk that maybe one of these days there's going to be a big upset in Texas, which is an enormous haul of electoral college votes. I don't think they're going to get there in Texas this cycle. I do think Texas is going to be really close, but still go red, maybe by a very thin margin this time, but not enough to swing it blue, unfortunately for the Harris team. So with just a week to go till the election, I think the Harris team, probably know that they've lost already and that there's nothing they can do. They're going to try their hardest to kind of push for the goal line, even though there's been a lot of early voting. There's still a lot of people who cast their vote on election day. So if they can catch some wind in the final news cycle and really kind of freak people out and kind of shock people to the polls, essentially, by saying, do you remember what a chaos merchant this guy was? So what I'm going to expect from them in the next 7 days is they're going to try, they know that they're on track to lose. They're going to try and shock the country into being really sort of freaked out about the prospect that this is happening, and just shock those kind of wavering voters back to the polls, or the people who are feeling a little bit apathetic about Kamala Harris, who, admittedly is not the best candidate, and I'll talk about that in a separate video. They're going to try and shock people to the polls and try and swing this back. And especially in Michigan, especially in Pennsylvania, especially in Wisconsin. And one of the other swing states that I didn't mention was Georgia. Georgia went for the Democrats last time, generally goes Republican. Again, I think you got the same problem in Atlanta with, minority and African American men, as much as the women in Atlanta need to turn out and vote for Harris and vote against Trump in order to carry Georgia. The other thing that carried Georgia last time was suburban housewives who just had enough of the kind of awfulness of Trump. And that actually brings me on to another point, which is, if I'm wrong here, I'm wrong for probably a really specific reason nationwide that might swing all of these elections in these various states more in the Democrat direction, which is women voters just being more motivated. The Republican Party continues to be quite aggressive against what a lot of women view as kind of just sort of basic women's rights. I mean, they've kind of fallen out with major conservative leaders like Liz Cheney, has effectively, she's very right-wing, but she's effectively left the Republican Party over the issue of all these kind of state abortion laws and how draconian and punitive they are for women who, through no fault of their own, might get in distress during pregnancy and have no medical recourse because of these crazy laws written by men who aren't medical doctors. That is a very animating issue, and it was part of why Trump lost the last election to Joe Biden. So if I'm wrong about all of this, it's because at the nationwide level, regardless of ethnicity, women, especially suburban women, just are more motivated to turn out because they view putting Trump back in the White House as a continued assault on women's rights and women's health care. And this has worked really well for the Democrats the last few election cycles. It's unclear to me how well it's going to work this time. But you know, if they hang on to Pennsylvania, if they hang on to Michigan, if they hang on to Georgia, if they hang on to Wisconsin, despite losses that they've made with Hispanic and African American men, it will be because they continue to gain traction with women who historically might be a bit more conservative and might be inclined to vote Republican, but who remain disgusted by Donald Trump's Republican Party specifically. And then there's another group, I think, which is sort of traditional conservatives who find Trump just sort of personally abhorrent and disgusting. I mean, you're probably aware that a large number of people with great stature who were in his previous administration have come out and said, you can't vote for this guy. He's an absolute maniac, to the point of maybe even being a national security risk to this country, because he's so erratic, he's so intemperate, doesn't matter how much you like his policies, the man himself is bad. Certainly, like Liz Cheney has come out and said this, but his former chief of staff, generals who worked for him, Mark Milley, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, these are, career soldiers and career politicians with a great deal of standing and stature in the community. And so I think to a lot of sort of traditional, sober Republicans, men and women, they kind of look at that and say, it doesn't matter, whether or not I agree with his policies. I might agree with his policies, but the man himself is too self-serving, he's too erratic, and he's kind of a risk to the country. And certainly some of the economic policies that he's come out with in the last few weeks have been potentially both economically and geopolitically disruptive, and I'll talk about that in a separate video because this one's getting quite long now. Yeah, so that's why this is such a hard one to call, because even though I think he's got this one in the bag because he's gaining with sort of minority men, and he's gaining with the union vote that used to be more reliably Democratic, he's still historically unpopular with women. And so it's kind of which force is more powerful and which force can be mobilized in this country more effectively in the last week of this election. Can this kind of moderate opposition to Trump bring in enough swing voters and independents to put Harris over the line? Or, do the unique demographic problems and shifts and views in a few places, Dearborn, Michigan, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and frankly Atlanta, Georgia, really what happens in those four towns may be more important than a national coalition of house mothers and women and housewives and whatever, soccer moms as they call themselves here, that national coalition of women who find Trump abhorrent and are going to come out and vote against him. How will that play out in the suburbs of Philadelphia? How will that play out in the suburbs of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Madison, Wisconsin? How will that play out in Detroit, or more than Detroit, I would say, the affluent suburbs like Grosse Pointe? How will that play out in all these places? Kind of hard to tell. It seems like it's not going to be enough this time to sort of overcome the other forces that I talked about in this little video presentation. So my gut tells me that it's going to be Trump and it's not going to be close, but I don't mean that it's not going to be close numerically. I just mean that he's going to hit the tipping point in those four states. Like I said, I think Harris is going to win more votes nationally, but I think these dynamics are going to hit tipping points in Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And so I think for that reason, I'm still saying it's Trump. But we'll see. I mean, no one really knows this time. Arguably, no one really knew the last couple of times. I got lucky. My forecasts were right the last 2 times. I don't necessarily want to get it right this time. I'd probably rather be wrong. But if I had $100 to bet right now and you forced me to pick one, I'd still pick him. So we'll see. Thanks for listening.